Okay.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Gay with God podcast. I am Midge Noble, your host, and today, ta-da, I have a guest. I know that you guys will say that you really like the things that I talk about when I'm by myself, but you also tell me that you really enjoy guests. So I'm very, very happy to have a guest for you today. And let me introduce you to Fran Leeman, who is the founding pastor of LifeSpring Church in Plainfield, Illinois. Along with his wife Linda and a few good friends, he has led his church for over 30 years. Fran is also the founder of New Life of Haiti for Haiti. Fran's book, The Everyday Gospel, chronicles his journey from a conservative evangelical mindset to embracing a bigger and more beautiful God, a richer understanding of the gospel and those in the LGBTQ community. We're also going to talk about the book that he has out. We may not get to everything, but if we don't, as you guys know, we'll just bring him back and go a little bit deeper. So, Pastor Fran, welcome to the Gay with God house.
Thank you, Midge. It's great to be with you today, truly.
Yes, it is truly an honor to be with you as well. And just for you guys, the backstory is that I was contacted by one of Pastor Fran's associates and said, "Hey, we'd like to have him on your show." And I kind of heard a little bit about what he was doing, and then you know the way we are, y'all, that we don't trust
Right? Of
all
course. Of
religious
course.
things, and
What's
so.
the old say? Trust but verify.
That's right. Trust but verify. That's perfect, Pastor Fred. Perfect. Because that's exactly what I did. I suggested that I didn't suggest. I said I need to have a phone call with Pastor Fran, and we had a delightful conversation. And that's why he's here, because I verified for myself and for you guys that he's on the up and up, and that what he's got going on is not a trick. It's not anything cagey. If you're in Illinois or you're in the surrounding areas and you want to go to his church, I would highly support that. And I'd put a big green check next to his church's name. So I can't wait for you to tell us your story, Pastor Fran. And if you want to, and we said in the bio that you did have a very conservative, narrow idea of homosexuality, and so tell us your story. Bring us up through the time of your exploration and how you got to be on this podcast today.
Okay. I'll try to give you the short version to start because I always tell people we've had quite a journey. So my wife Linda and I are a couple of Catholic kids who grew up here in the suburbs of Chicago. And we both came to kind of a more personal faith when we were in high school through kind of a Christian parachurch ministry outside of the church that we attended. Um, and we met in high school and we were kind of coming to faith and all of that. And we got married young. We got married at 20 years old. And together we journeyed out of our Catholic roots into more what I'll call kind of Bible preaching evangelical type churches. First, a very big one, then a smaller one. And all of that gave us a lot of good gifts. Like, we fell in love with Christ, we fell in love with Scripture. Um, we began to experience what it was to have the Spirit of God in our lives and working in us, all these beautiful things. But along with that, of course, we picked up, um, I would say, kind of a more fundamentalist approach to the Bible.
Hmm.
That's what I would call it today.
Hmm.
I wouldn't have said that certainly at the time.
Hmm.
Um, and we picked up, I didn't realize this, and I kind of tell this story in my book, but when we were, makes me sound old, but when we were coming up in faith, which was like the 1970s and 80s, right? There
Hmm.
was all this political shift going on in the United States, and the religious right was really just being born.
Hmm.
And with that, the religious right was the people behind that were championing a whole bunch of issues and telling us young Bible loving Christians this perspective on this issue is the only way you can look at it as a Christian.
Hmm.
So, those issues included, of course, abortion, of course, but then, everything around homosexuality and today what we would, think about in the broader category of, LGBTQ plus folks.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
so I fell into um, that we just naturally fell into that perspective
Right.
that at that time we weren't talking about anything other than gay people in terms of the LGBTQ kind of spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
But I fell into that perspective. We naturally fell into that perspective. If you're gay, God is against you. He's angry with you. You're probably going to hell.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then so anyway, 10 plus years in different churches, and then I had been feeling a call to ministry, went back to school, and in 1993, we moved one town over from where we lived. So we're at the edge of, I say we live at the edge of suburban sprawl around Chicago. We're in Plainfield, which, if anybody knows this area, kind of by Joliet, Naperville. Anyway, and we planted a church.
Mm-hmm.
And, we were nice people and we just wanted to help people come to a good faith and all that kind of stuff. But we kept going along largely in those, what today I would kind of call very conservative
Mm-hmm.
evangelical perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the one fly in the ointment for me with the issue of homosexuality was that my wife, she has three siblings, two sisters and a brother, and her only brother is gay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we didn't find this out until after we had planted this church. We were in our 30s, but he's one of my best friends.
Mm-hmm.
And he's an amazing human being.
Mm-hmm.
So I never quite could become, I hope this doesn't sound offensive to people, but it's just reality. I never quite could become that sort of gay hating Christian
Gotcha.
because I had this brother-in-law, this friend. But from a church perspective, um, I kind of felt like I had to toe that. I
Yeah.
had to toe that line. And that was,
That's
and I'd been, you know,
that was the reality of where you were, how you were raised. We've all been through that religious upbringing. Those of us who grew up in that church, in that kind of church, that was normal. That's why it took me 30 years. It's really
yeah,
indoctrinated in
right,
you.
right, exactly. You just think there is no other way to think
Right, right.
than this.
Yes.
And so and I'm a Bible guy. Like I read my New Testament in Greek, but I had just been told so strongly, this is just what the Bible says about these questions, that I never really dug deep into it. So fast forward, right? So this year our church is going to be, oh my goodness, 32 years old. So,
Wow.
yeah. So fast forward to about 8 years ago, 7, 8 years ago. Now we had gay folks come and attend our church from time to time, usually not stay that long, kind of sit in the back row, keep a low profile. We were always kind. Um, we didn't try to drive people away, but we also knew we were not really accepting, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Of those folks. So that kind of happened over the years. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, a gay couple came into our church, two women, two wonderful women, and they just really wanted to be a part of the community. They weren't asking to be leaders, they weren't trying to make waves, but they wanted to make friendships. They were already had a strong Christian faith, so they
Yeah.
loved Jesus.
Yeah.
So, I just thought, gosh, I love these people. So Linda and I and a few others received them with open arms, but it caused a stir in our church
I bet it
because,
did.
yeah, well, I always say, I had dodged all this for 25 years from a
Yeah.
church perspective. So I didn't talk about it from the pulpit. I avoided conversations about these issues. And all of a sudden, I had 20 or so people in my church really, really mad at me because I was giving safe quarter to these terrible, sinful people.
Mm.
And we were in an awkward place. Like Linda and I thought of ourselves as nice people, but built, this will sound weird, other than my brother-in-law,
Mm-hmm.
having friendship with gay
Right.
people was new territory for us. Like the
Yes.
first the first time Linda and I took this couple out to dinner, when we got back in the car, this is kind of a funny story. We got back in the car and I said to Linda, I said, "So how was that for you?" And literally with tears, she said, "Well, I didn't expect to fall in love with them, you know." Like, it was
Yeah.
like, and it's a feeling like, oh no, now. So people got mad. 15 or 20 people left the church. People confronted me and said, "You have to tell them to leave the church." And I said, I
Oh,
can't do that. I won't do
mm,
that.
good for
So
you.
they left instead.
That's
And
their
I,
choice.
yeah, it's their choice. And I began to have this epiphany that
Hmm.
my dodging days had come to an end, you know. I think that's how I called that chapter in the book, how my
Uh,
dodging days came to an
I
end.
love that.
And so I made this decision that I was going to go to our eldership team, which is kind of the core of our leadership team, and ask them to have a slow, reflective conversation about these things with me so we could
Hmm.
figure it out because we couldn't run from it anymore.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is like in our church, the way we lead, we're friends. But,
Hmm.
as a leadership team, we're friends, we're collaborative, we're not real, we have authority structures, but we don't reach for them very often because we lead
Hmm.
together, as
Hmm.
friends. And yet I was nervous about going to my eldership team with that conversation.
Yeah.
And I had to stop and say, why am I nervous? Well, part of it was these were issues we had all dodged, questions we had all dodged. But then I also realized we're just terrible at talking about big questions in the church. What churches typically do, especially conservative churches, is they figure out all their answers, they post them on the wall, call it their statement of faith, and they say, if you can agree with all this, you'll fit in our church.
Yep.
And I thought, boy, I literally went home one day and I said to Linda, I really had an epiphany today. And she said, what? I said, we suck at talking about stuff in the church.
Hmm.
Any kind of big questions. We
Hmm.
just want to think we have it all figured out. So I did go to my eldership team and I said, listen, I've been dodging this for 25 years. You guys have been dodging this for 25 years. Can we just have a really deliberate, deep, reflective conversation on all these issues? And of course, at that time, we were just talking about homosexuality.
Hmm.
Literally, it's not that we didn't know that there were, for example, transgender people. It's just that that wasn't even on our radar yet as a question.
Yeah. That was a big
Uh,
step. You needed to take that baby step.
yeah, which felt like a big step. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So so they said that yes, we could do that. Although we've always been a church that has women in leadership. One of our elders, a woman who was a widow, she left over it.
Oh, wow.
She said, no, we got to go the other way. And if you're not going to toe the line here, then I'm out basically.
Okay.
Um, but the rest of them, everybody was like, yeah, sure, let's do this.
Hmm.
So I said I was going to tell this short. That was not really true,
Well,
was it?
that's good.
Yeah.
I don't
Uh,
want you. I love this. The going deeper session is also on the table, so don't
okay,
worry about
okay,
it. We'll leave them with a cliffhanger, perhaps.
okay. So a few years before all this happened, so maybe, I don't know, pushing 10 years ago, we had done something unique for a church of our size, which is like today, if everybody showed up on one Sunday, we'd be a church of maybe 250 or a little better
Wow.
people. So,
Wow.
um, but we had done an interesting thing before this issue, before we came to the place where we said we have to have this conversation, and that was I'm I'm one of those geeks that loves the Bible and loves theology and loves big questions. And I had always wanted a community of people in our church who also really wanted to dig into all kinds of what I think are significant questions for us on the Christian journey. So we had started this little, I call it our theological think tank. We called it our Crux community. Crux is the Latin word that means cross, but it also means like a crossroads. Like, whenever every time you ask a big question, you kind of come to a crossroads of some kind,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
So some of our eldership team, they were involved in that Crux community. So the Crux community were the ones who took up this topic. First
Okay.
thing we did, so we got everybody on board. We're going to have this conversation. I said, I don't know if it's going to be 4 weeks or 10 months or 3 years. It turned out to be a 6 year conversation.
Wow.
It really wouldn't have been that long, except that we had a pandemic in there.
Oh, yeah.
And,
Right.
and yeah, and I did not want to do these conversations by
Yeah.
Zoom.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wanted to do
Yeah.
them face to face. So we had a
Right.
we had a hiatus or
There
two
you
in the
go.
middle there,
Yeah.
you know.
Okay. That makes sense.
Um, but the first thing we did was we worked through the five major texts that
Mm-hmm.
Christians often consider relevant to this conversation of
Mm-hmm.
homosexuality. And we all learned that there was a lot of ambiguity around like, for example, the Greek words that Paul uses. We learned that um, there was a lot of lost cultural and religious history surrounding the Levitical texts, things like
Mm-hmm.
that. And we all kind of came away gratefully, kind of saying, "Boy, these are really hard texts to make the kind of ironclad arguments from that
Right.
people want to make, right?"
Yep.
Then we all watched, the Netflix documentary Pray Away about, the 40 years of Exodus International and the gay conversion therapy
Yes.
movement.
Phew, that
And
was brutal.
it was brutal.
Yeah.
And it was so eye-opening. I think most of us had heard of it, but
Mm-hmm.
that's really different from seeing the staggering numbers of people who went through it,
Yeah.
and not only its dismal failure, but the damage it did
Yes.
to people
Mm-hmm.
was heartbreaking. There's
Mm-hmm.
that closing scene in Pray Away where the leaders of Exodus sit in a church basement with a bunch of the people who'd been wounded by that ministry over the years, and they listen to how these people have been shamed and traumatized, even worse. And it was after that meeting that the leaders of Exodus basically said, "We got to shut this down.
Mm-hmm.
We got to stop doing this."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we did that. Um, and then I will take the time to tell you this story because it's so amazing. Uh, okay. So what happened as we're doing this, right? Now keep in
Mm-hmm.
mind, we just have this one gay couple coming to our church, right?
Right.
As far as we know, of course, we
Right.
all know that all kind, but as far as we knew, there's nobody else in our church who's struggling with their sexuality or their gender or whatever. But uh, during this time that we were beginning this kind of conversation and this exploration, a, a really interesting God thing started happening, which is that people started wandering into our church first, people who had grown gay children. And
Mm-hmm.
they were looking for a different church because they were tired of hearing their children bashed in the churches they had attended.
Yes. Yeah.
And it was awkward a little bit because they came in and they said, "Where's your church with this issue?" In fact, they emailed me first and then they showed
Mm-hmm.
up and they said, "Well, where's your church with this issue?" And I said, we're having a conversation. That's where we are. And thankfully, and these folks are still in our church, and thankfully they said, "Well, you know what? We're going to stick around and see where that conversation goes."
Mm.
Then they brought a handful of their gay friends
That's
into
awesome.
our church. And their gay friends said, "Where's your church with this?" And I said, "Well, we're having a conversation." Um, and so then, after we did looked in the Bible passages, we did the pray away, and we talked about that, watched that documentary. I I very with some trepidation, I said to our Crux community, which by this point included pretty much all our elders, because everybody wanted in on this conversation.
I bet.
And I said, "I have an idea, and I don't know what you guys will think of it." I said, "But it occurs to me," I said, "I have a brother-in-law who's gay, but it occurs to me that some of you do not have a family member or a friend who is gay. And I'm wondering how you would feel if we hosted a Crux evening where we had these folks that we have met who have gay kids, who have raised gay kids, or who are gay themselves. Um, and in the end, actually, one trans person also came. How would how would you feel if we brought them together for an evening and just let them tell us their stories? Not there for a conversation, a debate, just to listen. Because I
Mm.
said, I'm not sure that all of us have rubbed shoulders enough with the people that we have long judged.
That's
And I was,
beautiful.
and I had some trepidation about that,
Yeah. Yeah.
And to their credit, they all said, "That sounds fantastic." Um, and I have to say, my friends, who are also our leadership team, they surprised me at many points in this journey. We easily could have been that church that just shipwrecked. It's not that we never had awkward conversations or tense conversations. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
early on in a Crux conversation, one of our friends on the leadership team, she said, with a lot of passion, and I get it, I appreciate it. She said, "I just want to know if it's sin. If it's sin, I know how to answer the question. I just want to know that."
Uh-huh.
And I remember calmly saying, "Well, that's what we're trying to figure out."
Yep.
you know.
Yep.
Um, so we had this evening where these folks joined us, told their stories, I even invited my brother-in-law, who does not live right here.
Nice.
And and my wife was like, well, I don't know if he'd come. And he is a Christian. She said, I don't know. And he emailed me back in 30 seconds, like, I'll be there.
That's nice.
And these folks all told their stories. There was, we listened. There was some conversation. There was some laughter, but there were also tears because we heard really hard stories about people
Mhm.
being kicked out of their homes,
Mhm.
about people having lost relationships with their parents, about people's own heartbreaking shame. One couple told us the story of their uh, daughter who happened to be biracial and gay in a largely white school
Mm,
here in the area, and how she was bullied all through high school.
mm,
And that evening may have been, of all the many events that were part of our journey with this, that may have been the most uh, the evening that most qualifies as kind of a turning point,
mm.
because at the end of the evening, as people were kind of breaking up and putting chairs away, we did it in our church cafe. There were about 20 or 25 of us sitting together, and at the end of the evening, as it was breaking up, uh, one of our good friends on the leadership team, probably my wife's best friend, but who started this journey, I would say, at an even far more conservative place than we were.
Mm,
She turned to me with tears running down her face, and she
mm.
said, "We got to stop doing this to people."
Oh.
And I knew what she meant. We Christians,
Mhm.
we who
Mhm.
name the name of Jesus, we
Mhm.
have to stop doing this to people. And I just
Mhm.
thought, I didn't know what to say. My breath was taken away. I thought, oh my goodness, this was perspective changing for her. I mean, it,
Mhm.
it was for me, but for her, it felt to me like she had taken a very large leap in 2 hours,
Mhm.
you know?
Mhm.
Um, and then, throughout this whole process, from time to time, I would gather our eldership team, our strategic team, and then the members of our Crux community who weren't on either of those teams, and I would say, "So where are we in this journey?"
Right.
And after that evening, um, we decided uh, they thought the wise thing to do, and we had, by the way, when we first decided to start this journey, I stood up in front of the congregation and told them we were going to do it. I
Mhm.
said, listen, I said, so now I'm backing up the timeline a little bit, but I said to our congregation, this is right around the time those 15 or 20 people were leaving who were,
Mhm.
angry with us. And I said to the congregation, I confessed to them, I said, I've dodged this issue for 25 years. And you guys probably know that. We don't talk about it in our church. I said, you also know there have been conversations in the hallways, and some people are angry with me because I won't
Mhm.
do what they immediately want me to do
Mhm.
on these questions. I said, but what we've decided to do as a leadership team is have a slow, reflective, deep conversation about this. And at some point, we will bring you all into the conversation. And I made
Mhm.
that commitment to them. We will
Mhm.
not figure this out. 20 of us will not figure this out and then tell you what we figured
Mhm.
out.
Mhm.
So after that Crux evening where we heard all these stories and where hearts were so touched, we had our first evening of congregational conversation where we invited anybody who wanted to. Probably 60 people showed up, um, which was significant. We were smaller then than we are now, which is a whole
Mhm.
nother story. But so, and we let people get into little groups. And we did this a couple of times through the process. Get into little groups and ask questions. And then whatever the biggest questions were that seemed to arise out of each little group, then we gathered in a big group at the end of the evening, and I tried to kind of speak what I could at that
Yeah.
point to
Mhm.
to those questions.
Mhm.
And I remember the first evening we did that, I went home. I said to Linda, I said, what's amazing about this evening isn't just that we're in this journey with these questions about gay people. I said, what's also amazing is we just gathered a huge part of our church community together, And we had an evening of open conversation about one of the toughest issues in the church, and nobody got mad.
That's
Everybody was
amazing.
civil. Yeah, everybody was civil. Everybody was kind. And it's not that there was maybe not an awkward moment or something.
Uh-huh.
I'll tell you a funny story. The second evening we did, when we were, that evening was in some ways, I don't know, not more intense. It was just we were coming into those questions of like, what are we going to do about this, right? And when we gathered everybody into one large group after they'd been in these small groups, and they handed me this stack of questions they wanted me to speak to, me who was still in process, of course, right?
Yeah,
And my wife, my sweet wife, leaned over to me with a little twinkle in her eye, and she said, "Well, buddy, you're in it now."
that's right.
And and we were in it. And yeah, so that is, I preached about it a couple of times across that 6 years, kind of updating people, kind of where we were, what I had learned. I did a sermon where I said, we've all heard this is what the Bible teaches. So I'm going to share with you guys this morning what I've learned about those Bible passages. I did a,
Good for
a sermon
you.
just on that. Um, and in the end, so this is now about 2 years ago, we came to this place where, again, one evening, I gathered our eldership team, our strategic team, and our Crux community on our screen porch at home. And I said, "Where are we?"
Hmm.
Oh, I left out something really interesting. So this would be, I'm terrible with chronology, somewhere later on in this process,
Okay.
when we did one of these check-ins with the whole leadership team. But it was after that Crux evening where all those folks had come and told their stories, right?
Hmm.
I got our team together and I said, "So what is the next step? What are we doing here? Where are we going?"
Hmm.
And that same friend who had said, "We got to stop doing this to people,"
Hmm.
she said, "Well, I think what you need to do is you need to do on a Sunday morning what we did that evening in Crux. You need to, on a Sunday morning, interview some of these folks in front of the congregation." Now, keep in mind, we are nowhere near taking an affirming stance yet, right?
Right,
In fact,
right.
I've even been afraid to even raise that question so
Yeah.
far. And I sat there thinking, is my friend who started at this very conservative place, is she really suggesting that I interview gay people on Sunday morning in front of our church?
As
I
a
thought I was
sermon?
having, Midge, I thought I was having an out-of-body experience. Uh,
You
and
were.
then, yeah, and then others said, "Yeah, let's do that." And I was like, my first thought was, would they be willing to do that? Would it feel safe? So I said, "I'll ask them."
Yeah. Good
So
for you.
I,
Yeah.
I did, and they all said yes.
Wow.
And that set of interviews is still on our website. We called that series "Jesus, Love, and the LGBTQ Community,"
Wow.
and and people still find those and watch them, and are kind of, their minds are blown that those conversations were being had in church. So then eventually, we did all these things, and it just felt like, well, here's what I knew. I didn't know where we were going to land in terms of some official, decision. But eventually, what I knew is there was nobody on our leadership team or really in our church anymore who thought we could live where we had lived previously.
Hmm.
We couldn't be judgmental. We had to be accepting. And eventually, the team basically said, and there were all these, the team basically said, "Yes, we need to affirm and include people." But there were those tough conversations too, because someone would say, like, "Yeah, let's be accepting and affirming." And somebody else on the team would say, "So does that mean that an LGBTQ person can teach in Kids Spring, which is our Sunday school program? Can they serve communion? Can they be on a leadership team? Can they?" And then there would be moments of,
Hmm.
yeah. We have to, and for a while there were a couple of people who said, I think we can just accept people and kind of let everybody have their own opinion. And at first I thought, yeah, that sounds great. And then I thought, except as a church, you have a communal life. You
Right.
have a life you live together. And in that life, you do make decisions about who can minister in certain ways or who can lead in certain ways. And I thought, that sounds great, but you're going to, and we had heard stories from friends who had been part of churches, kind of bigger churches, where the churches projected a very accepting, kind of ethos or culture. And then at some point, like we knew these two guys, a gay couple, wonderful guys. They'd been in a church for 6 years and they felt very accepted. It's kind of a big mega church, seeker church in our area. And then after 6 years, one of them, he'd been involved in a certain ministry. And he said, oh, I think they said there's a volunteer opportunity to lead this team. He said, oh, I'd love to do that. So his desire to lead that team kind of went up the chain, leadership chain, came back down, and they said, well, you can't lead the team. You're gay.
Oh my
Well,
goodness.
after 6 years, that was the first he'd heard of it.
Oh my goodness.
So we realized you can't do that to people. You
That's the
gotta,
difference between saying all are welcome and are you really welcoming and
yes,
non-judgmental.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in the end, everybody said, yeah, we just have to, you know, and it happens in stages, right? The biblical
Yeah.
arguments kind of fell, and then the historical arguments fell. Like I still have people say to me, because of course, as you can imagine, as an evangelical type pastor, I mean, I don't totally call myself that anymore, but I've gotten some flack and criticism for our
Yeah.
church going in these directions.
Yeah.
And people will say to me, well, don't you believe God can change people? And my answer is always this: I believe God can do anything. However, if you know the history of the gay conversion therapy movement, you have 40 years of faithful Christians, faithful gay Christians, begging God to change them, and God really didn't do it.
That's
So,
right.
can he? Yes. Does he seem terribly inclined to do so? Not
No,
really.
not really.
Yeah. So, and usually people are like, huh? And I'm like, you don't know that history, really, do you? And usually they
Mm-hmm.
don't really know that history.
Mm-hmm.
And so we settled into this place, and you know, just about 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago this month, I sat in front of our church community with my friend Leslie. She's our kind of my right hand in a lot of ways. She leads our strategic team. And we recounted the whole journey, the 6 year journey in front of the congregation, because there's always new people coming in. So we recounted the whole 6 year journey and then said, and here's what we've decided is that we are going to affirm and include instead of judging and excluding. And everybody, the sanctuary thundered with applause.
That's awesome.
And 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 yet at the same time, it was almost anticlimactic because we had journeyed there together. And when the words came out of my mouth that we were going to be an affirming church, the look on everybody's faces was like, well, duh. We spent
We
six
already
years
are.
getting right. We already are. We spent 6 years getting here.
Uh-huh.
And today, I will tell you, our church looks really, really different
Yeah.
as a result of this in what I would call beautiful ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the, you know,
That's the arc of the story. That, you know,
it,
what I love most of all is that you had the courage, your team, you as their actual leader and the team had the courage to lean in because I've been in that situation. I grew up believing that one of my dear friends in high school was, gay. And so therefore there was this, I'm going to, love the sin or hate the sin kind of thing that we all hate
yeah,
on this side of the table now
yeah, yeah,
because
yeah,
that's so disparaging. And,
yeah.
I pushed her away and I thought I was being righteous. And then when I realized that I was gay, I was
Mm,
tormented by what I had done. And by then I had lost, all contact with her. There was no way to
yeah.
find her. I turned it over to God and I said, I really need to make this right. I said, I am taking on what I did to her. I have it now, but I want to make it right. I want her to know. that I understand and that I'm sorry. And it was probably 20 years. I searched, I kept looking, I kept praying, and then one day I found her.
Oh my
And we
goodness.
were able to meet. She agreed to meet with me, which surprised me. That was phase one, that she wouldn't, I was afraid she wouldn't even let me come. But I went to her home. She was actually at the time dying of cancer, but she
Mm,
was, ambulatory, but she would be dying. And she said, I just needed to know what you had to say. And
mm,
so I said what I needed to say, and I cried. She cried. We had a big hug. She said, I can die in peace now.
mm,
I cannot tell you how grateful I was to God that God saw
mm.
that as a not just for me, but especially for her. I wanted it for her, but it
Yeah,
released me of the guilt that I had carried all those years, and it released her of that hatred that she felt for me. And I never hated her. I just thought I was being righteous. And
right.
so when people say to me now, like on your side of the table, when they say something and, well, what do you think? They go through all this stuff. And I said, listen, I don't judge you. I said, I've been you. Listen,
Right.
I was raised in the fundamentalist church. I read those scriptures. I was told what they meant, and I believed them all the way through my adult
Yeah.
life almost. And I
Yeah.
said, so the thing that I love is that you guys took that journey, and so many churches never even, they're too afraid to go to hell to take
Yeah.
that journey. And that's the way,
Right.
and that's why I break it down for all of my gay friends who still hate the church so much. They can't even go into a church. And I was like that. I wouldn't go into one either.
Yeah.
But
Right.
then it was like God just kept saying, you gotta finish this. You're not there yet. And so I tell people, I get it. That's part of the journey is to you hate what hated you. But yet God never
Yeah.
did. God never hated us. And if it was so important to be talked about, Jesus would have said it in some time in his ministry.
Right.
It never
Right.
came up.
Right. Right.
Came up.
Yeah. It's so amazing to me that we who have talked about grace so much
Mm-hmm.
are so afraid of judgment.
Mm-hmm.
I just think I think we have the right concept with grace. I just think that we don't know what that is,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that we're swimming in grace, that you couldn't possibly. A friend of mine used to say, with regard to God, he used to say, you couldn't possibly be more loved than you are at this moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's, I appreciate you saying, I think our team was really courageous.
Oh, yes.
Sometimes people have said to me, or said to me even during the process, uh, like a couple who came into our church kind of toward the end of the process. They were just amazed because they had this long conservative church history. They were just amazed and they said, you are so brave. And I said, I've spent most of the last 6 years terrified.
Absolutely. But that is the definition of bravery. You're terrified and you still go forward.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that's what bravery is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just got, I came to the place where I just didn't really feel like we couldn't, I felt compelled to go forward.
Yeah.
It didn't feel like, and it was scary. And
Mm-hmm.
although I will tell you something crazy, my wife and I have calculated, we think that after that initial group of people who left, when the whole cataclysm kind of started,
Mm-hmm.
we think over that 6 years, over this issue, we lost two people.
Wow.
That's it.
Wow.
And the only explanation I have for that, aside from the grace of God and being a pretty open-hearted church, is that we took this journey together with our church.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't figure it out and tell them what it was going to be.
Right.
We said you all get to be in on the conversation, and we'll take
Right.
as much time as we need, and
Yeah. Yeah.
so
So when you said that your church looks really different than it did, tell us how it looks different. Besides, it
uh,
sounds like your numbers have increased a lot.
they have. In fact, this is no joke. Today, before I got on this call with you,
Mm-hmm.
I was rearranging chairs in our sanctuary, trying to figure out how many more chairs we could squeeze in if we made people sit in rows that were closer together. So, so yes, we are growing, and we're having parking problems and space
Mm-hmm.
problems, and so the way it looks different is that um, well, I've lost count of how many gay folks come to
Mm-hmm.
our church.
Mm-hmm.
Lots.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so interesting because I'm not going to say all of them, but most of them have a pretty conservative church history.
Mm-hmm.
And many of them were away from church for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
or would occasionally bop into a church kind of incognito, but not really
Yeah.
put down roots there,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
because they wanted to go worship with some people, but then they knew, it wasn't really a place for them. There wasn't really a place for them there. We also have, and we have, oh, I don't know. I suppose we have maybe a half a dozen trans folks who are part of our community, who all have very different stories from each other,
Mm-hmm.
how
Mm-hmm.
they, you know, what their journey has been with all of that. But, um, and then I have definitely lost track of how many people we have who have raised gay kids.
Mm-hmm.
And whether most of their kids are grown now, whether they go to church or don't go to church, the parents have kind of said, I just can't be a part of a church anymore that won't love people like my children.
Yep. Yep.
I just can't do that. And
Mm-hmm.
most of them not with a real judgmental attitude, just more like, I just can't do that anymore,
Mm-hmm.
Because one
Mm-hmm.
of the things we really try to cultivate, is, you know, even if we've been treated with contempt or anger, to be careful not to adopt that same frame of heart toward everybody who once wronged us. And I'm sure
Mm-hmm.
you understand that territory
Mm-hmm.
perhaps better than I do. There's a quote I love from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who is not terribly popular among Christians, but he said a really profound thing. He said, "Be careful in fighting the monster that you do not become the monster." And
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, so we have a ton of people who, have raised gay kids, some who are raising gay kids. We have a couple of little kids in our church that the parents are like, my child is different in these ways, and so we're walking through that. Um, and so this will maybe sum up what feels. So it's different in that sense. Like you walk in and, if you stick around for a little bit, you go, oh, those two guys are a couple, those two women are a couple. This person seems like this, right? But but other than that, we're still the same Jesus-centered,
Mm-hmm.
open-hearted community. And a good story to kind of summarize how I feel about it is I was having coffee with a Baptist pastor friend, nothing against Baptists. I know great Baptists, but Baptist pastor friend who is upset with me for making these decisions and has kind of unfriended me, so to speak. But the
Mm-hmm.
last time we had coffee together and we were talking about these questions, I kind of, I suppose I messed with him a little bit because I leaned in and I said to him, do you know what it feels like now that we have, LGBTQ folks in our church? And he kind of looked at me and he said, what does it feel like? And I said, it just feels normal.
Mm-hmm.
I said, they're just people.
Mm-hmm.
I said, it just feels normal. I said, it's just a community where everybody, and when I watch Midge on Sunday mornings, like there is not a drop. I mean, somebody who comes into our church, maybe from a real conservative background, they might have to acclimate or even figure out, like, is this the church for me? But with the people who are part of this church community, there is not a drop of awkwardness. I just love to walk through our cafe on Sunday morning before service and just see everybody hugging and talking and catching up, and it's gay and it's straight and it's trans and it's whatever, and it just it's not a thing any more than it would be a thing any more than we would make a big thing out of, like, oh, we're together and some of us are black and some of us are white, like,
Right.
so, right, like,
It's kind of like heaven.
yeah, kind of like heaven, like, so what? And
Yeah.
if you would have told me 10 years ago that
Yeah.
LifeSpring Church would look like this, I would have thought maybe I need to retire before we get there. So,
Well, let me ask this question. And I don't remember if I asked you this when we talked before. But did you guys ever as a team and as a church answer the question, can a gay person serve in
oh, of
church?
course they can. Absolutely.
Bingo. Ding, ding, ding,
Yeah,
ding, ding, ding,
yeah, yeah,
ding.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. They absolutely can. This past summer, two guys who started attending our church, I did my first gay wedding. And they were so grateful I was willing to do that, and I was grateful because I needed to step into that territory.
Mm-hmm.
And it was beautiful.
Mm.
And again, it just felt normal. I know that would freak
Yep.
some people out, but it just felt
Yep.
normal. Yeah, there's no limitations in our church
Mm-hmm.
community
That
on
is awesome.
on how a person can serve or where
Mm-hmm.
they can be involved or
Mm-hmm.
any of those kind of things. So um, yeah, it's been an amazing journey. And the other thing I was good you asked about, it seems like we're growing. We are also I talk a lot these days about what I feel like is a shift that's happening in the church. It may be a minority movement, certainly, but I feel like most of my adult Christian life, and again, this is kind of in the Bible preaching evangelical type churches, we've all kind of been told, like, hey, we have the Bible, so all the big questions are answered. So you don't really need to ask questions, and there's a whole list of things we don't really need to talk about, right? But between uh, a lot of this judgmentalism that we have seen coming from Christians,
Mm-hmm.
between the what I'll call sort of the political idolatry of Christians, um, and some other theological questions people are wrestling with, particularly questions about whether God is violent. I can't tell you how
Mm.
many people I see wrestling now with some of the violent portrayals of God in Scripture, and then wrestling with that against the teaching of Jesus, who who literally quotes uh, the law of retribution from the Old Testament, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and then he says, "But I tell you no." Like people are wrestling with these questions, and they want to talk about them.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we're seeing in our area, I only know Chicago, I,
Mm-hmm.
and what we're seeing is a friend of mine called them ecclesiological refugees, people who are looking at the churches they've been a part of, where if they don't hate Democrats and gay people, or if they don't have a certain political allegiance, or if they don't hold to a certain theology that is pretty heavily weighted with judgment and violence in terms of
Yeah.
how we see God,
Yeah.
they're saying, I can't be a part of this church anymore. So what do
Mm.
I do? And now they're out wandering.
Mm-hmm.
Our church is becoming um, a healing refugee camp
Yeah.
for people.
Yeah.
And I never saw that coming either.
Yeah.
But I will say, I feel really, really, really humbled
Mm.
that God is letting us play this part in such a strange church and culture moment like we are
Mm-hmm.
in.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
You're in the
so,
middle of the quilt making. All the pieces are being patched together, and you guys are an integral. You're like the center of the quilt, the most important part,
yeah,
because you're bringing people from all walks of life and all different experiences, and you're bringing literally heaven on earth. And I'm not just blowing smoke. I really believe that
no,
that your community is like a little bubble of heaven on earth. And if everybody else would pay attention and be able to take that journey, it would grow. I mean, it would have to
yeah.
grow.
What you're describing, if I were to frame it in a little bit of theological framework, is I spent decades in a kind of Christianity, which gave me many gifts and for which I'm
Yes.
grateful. I'm a
Yes.
Richard Rohr fan, so always include your
Yes.
past. Don't judge it and kick it to the curb. It got me what I experienced before is what got me here, right?
Yes. Love that.
So, but uh, but that said, that I'm so grateful for it, it was also a kind of faith that said, hey, this is just about accepting Jesus so you can get off the hook for your sins and go to heaven. We're just getting people saved here. That was kind of the mentality,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what you're describing when you say heaven on earth is now I understand the gospel. I can sum up the gospel in in some of the last words that God speaks in the book of Revelation. Behold, I make all things new.
That's right.
God is restoring everything. So now our churches, we talk a lot about what it means to be on this journey toward wholeness as human beings. We didn't even used to use words like that, you know, and it's good to see new things.
Yeah.
It's humbling. you know.
Yeah. Yeah. And with the next 4 years in front of us, and there's going to be so many more wounded people.
Oh,
Yeah. So many more
you
wounded
with
people.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And that conversation is a big conversation around our
I
church.
bet.
And it's not that in our church we do have people in our church who lean more politically conservative. So there are sometimes awkward moments talking
Yeah.
about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, but I have stood up front and said, we are now a church that includes some people who fall into the marginalized category, and this will be a safe and protective place for them. And
Amen.
and everybody in our church is like, yes,
Yes.
so
Good job. Good job.
um, but uh, yeah, so that's
Yeah.
our story, and I'm
You're
sticking to
sticking
it.
to
So
it. Well, and you're going to have to come back because we've not even talked about your book. There are going to be more questions, I'm sure, once people hear this session, which we will air on Monday. So
okay,
I'll clean it up. Not, I don't think I'm going to have to do thank you. I'm not going to have to do very much work at all. And so we'll clean it up and we'll post it on Monday. And I will resend you the link so that we can get you
okay,
back on the show to talk about your book. And
wonderful.
also, I want to, I meant to do this after we talked last time, and I totally forgot to find those videos. I want to find the videos off of your church page and link
Okay,
them to the show page. So,
okay, I can send you that link.
oh, that would be so
Yeah,
much, that
yep,
would be so
yep,
much quicker.
yeah. Well,
Not that.
it would be gracious of you to have me back. That would be
I would love
enjoyable. So
and I know my guests I have some folks that give me a heads up. This one needs to be a going deeper one. I get instructions, which is very helpful. But I am just so grateful that you guys contacted me and asked to be on my show. For you to even find my show was just a thrill for me because I don't know how far it may go, but I do know it goes to England for sure. I know it does go to other
that's
countries,
awesome.
but I have a very, very faithful listener from
Yeah.
England, and so that's so exciting. Um, but I do want to have you back, absolutely for sure, and
Okay.
we'll talk about your book and many other things, I'm sure. But that would be great. So
Okay. All right.
thank you,
Wonderful.
thank you, thank you.
Thank
So,
you, Midge.
oh, you are welcome. You are welcome. You're a godsend for so many people. So, guys, thank you for listening and being a part of another episode of Gay with God. And thank you for sharing and supporting and subscribing to this podcast and getting the good news out that we can reclaim our faith and honor our stories and that we are loved by God. Remember to check out the Facebook group Gay with God, where we do a monthly Zoom group entitled My Faith Journey. If you need support, and we're really expecting you guys to stay in community in the next few years because being by yourself is unbearable. And it's a whole lot more fun to be within a loving community. So my faith journey offers you that. We talk about anything we want to talk about that affects your faith journey or inspires your faith journey. Remember that if you're listening to this podcast and are questioning whether you can be in a relationship with the God of your understanding, if you identify as LGBTQIA+, are not even sure if you're gay, God has always been within you. Even when you didn't know it, you have always been gay with God. Thank you, everybody. Stay tuned to see how you can join the Gay with God community. And as always, you are loved.